When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Another switchback. Wait, this isn't the top. Where's the summit? Why am I doing this?
At REI Co-op, we believe there are places within ourselves
Almost there. You got this.
that we find only outside.
Wow. This is worth it.
We have the gear, inspiration, and advice to help you get there. REI Co-op. Visit rei.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find order in our mad, 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 mad world.
And this week, it's one of our favorites. It's listener questions. And I believe it is the first time that Jane and I get to do listener questions. As you, the mega orderer, will be well aware, Alex Hall has sailed off into the sunset to deal with her own crises in the mad world. And as they say, to focus on her family. And Jane and I are really excited to inject new energies and new ideas into the listener questions. So we are hoping that once a month or so, we will be collating questions, and we're going to try to tackle them. So today, Jane, we have nuclear proliferation, Trump scandals, a touch of Epstein, a lot of Ukraine-Russia. All of this is on the menu from the listeners for the listeners.
Great, Jason. So we'll start with a nuclear amuse-bouche, and hopefully we could get to some Middle Eastern desserts too, with all that's going on in that part of the world. Thanks very much to you, the listeners, for placing your disorder orders, so to speak, and setting us this good agenda for our discussion. I also wanted to mention that in the last few weeks, I've taken up a new role in my day job. So I'm now Chief Executive at the United Nations Association of the UK, which is where I'm sitting today. We are an NGO. We are an 80-year-old organisation with a grassroots base around the UK, standing up for the principles of the UN and hoping that we can also work for an effectively engaged UK in that UN. So lots of relevance to what we talk about here at Disorder, and I'll be happy in subsequent episodes to talk more about the many things that are going on at the UN at the moment as it prepares to find its next Secretary General. The joys of finding someone that the big powers can all agree on will be quite interesting in the months ahead, while also slashing budgets.
What you're saying, Jane, is you are actually a mega orderer in real life, and I just play one on TV.
Well, a big part of it is about having a bigger conversation about multilateralism and how it works, right? You have to engage people in these discussions that a lot of people think are just irrelevant to them these days.
Yes, and whether the UN is working or not, how it can be made to work better, What would multilateralism without the UN look like? All the kind of questions that our faithful care about. But without further ado, Jane, we know how much you like to preach the gospel of non-proliferation. So I'm going to toss the first softball to you from Mark H. He writes, in the new world where Europe cannot rely on the USA for protection, should the British government consider canceling Trident, which I believe can only be launched with American support and therefore permission, and replacing it with French nuclear weapons? And I need to interject before we start. Everything that Mark H. said there is not necessarily true. So it is a great question, Mark, but I will question some of the veracity of the assumptions of this question. But first, I kick it to you, Jane.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Mark for the question. And indeed, there is the assumption in there that the US would need to give permission for the UK to use its nukes. That is not, strictly speaking, the case. The UK depends on the US to maintain and renew its nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have to go and say, "Hi, Daddy, please, may we use them?" Not least because in any nuclear crisis, the decision-making time is horrendously short. So the Prime Minister of the UK has to write letters of last resort that are held in nuclear submarines to give the authorization for weapons to be carried in certain circumstances. They cannot also bring in the dimension of going to the US and asking permission if there might be literally only minutes to make that decision. Hopefully that would never happen, but that is the thinking about it. But certainly, in the longer term, the UK system is completely intertwined with the US, and it requires US goodwill.
Yes, Jane, it requires the UK to lease from Lockheed Martin the missiles on which the deterrents sit. So Trident is a fully British submarine, and it is a British deterrent. The nuclear warhead or the nuclear bomb that blows up is British made, but the missile which delivers it is not bought from the US, it is leased. And therefore, there is this aspect of needing continued special relationship there.
Which applies to the whole of the UK security setup, really, that it's really deeply entangled with the US. And we've discussed this before on the podcast. Can the UK even conceive of a model of having its security that would be fit for a world where the US did abandon it? Right now, what we're seeing is that the UK, like Germany and others, is trying to figure out how it can hedge its bets, but it does not want to do anything that looks like it would be pushing the US away. So what has happened most recently around the NATO summit is that the UK has said it will get more involved in nuclear sharing with the US under a NATO umbrella. The submarines have been the entire focus of the UK's nuclear programme for many years, but the UK is now going to be purchasing some aircraft that are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and those would be American nuclear warheads deployed to NATO. So basically, the thinking that's going on right now is about how can we keep the US in rather than how can we cope without the US.
100%. I think that you've expressed that very clearly. The difference in the British as opposed to the French approach to both the nuclear deterrent question, their positionality in the NATO alliance is as follows. The UK, since the 1950s, has wanted to deepen its ties to America, to offload security responsibilities to America, to work with America, to guide America, as Blair tried to do to prevent it from making mistakes in places like Iraq and to try to have it change strategy, but then to go along with whatever the US was doing. And the French strategy from de Gaulle to the present has to have the ability to act independently. And that's why the French manufacture their entirely separate nuclear deterrent. They own the missiles, they have the airplanes that can drop it, and they make the nuclear themselves. And when push comes to shove and the Americans ask them, will you do Iraq with us? They say no. I think it is very interesting, Mark H., to envision a situation in which Britain would go more down the French route, but it seems slightly unlikely, and that's not how Keir has approached the tariff negotiations. Keir Starmer's position is, how can I go to Washington first, get the best deal, and rope the U.S. into a special trading, just like we have a special nuclear and a special defense relationship.
Let me come back to the second bit of Mark's point about could Britain replace US weapons with French ones, because there is more coordination now between Britain and France. They've made statements recently when Macron came on his big visit to London just this month about coordinating their nuclear programs more. And that is significant because, as Jason said, France has always wanted its program to be really independent. France is in NATO, but it doesn't commit its nuclear weapons to NATO. So it's not necessarily the case that if a nuclear country attacked NATO, France would use its nukes in any kind of response, even a theoretical one, to deter. But Macron is signalling something about wanting to coordinate more with the UK, which in French terms is really significant. However, we just return to a fundamental problem, which is the anxiety around Trump. It's not just about Trump, it's the broader wave of neopopulist and isolationist politicians that we see in many places. So at the end of the day, if you think the US is unreliable, maybe we can rely on France, maybe we can rely on Germany. That may not work if the political systems of those countries end up being led by Marine Le Pen, or perhaps less likely, the AfD. France's nuclear policy is totally in the hands of the French president, so it could be vulnerable too to somebody who just thinks about these things totally differently from Macron.
Worrying thoughts, Jane. Fortunately, we have to remind the listeners that Le Pen is barred from running in the 2027 presidential. Hurrah. And I don't think we're going to have a nuclear war anytime soon, but it is interesting how beggar thy neighbor policies cause other people to adopt them. If I do tariffs, you have to do reciprocal tariffs. If I feel the need to have nuclear independence, then you feel like you need to have nuclear independence. If I proliferate and the Iranians get the bomb, then the Saudis need to get the bomb. If the Saudis get the bomb, then the Emiratis probably need to get the bomb. So, yes, there are all these pressures for more proliferation right now, and it is a topic which is near and dear to our hearts, so we'll be returning to it.
Jason, I am going to hand you a question on one of your very favourite subjects. Yes, it is a question about President Trump and the state of American politics, and it comes from Gareth P., who lives in Australia. I also have some family in Australia. There are quite a few Kinnenmonts over there, possibly because of me having criminal forebears that I'm not highly aware of in any detail. But anyway, Gareth is in Australia and he says, I have found myself enraged at Trump and the false and inaccurate statements that he has shamelessly thrown out, both to the American people and the world. I am at a complete loss as to how people can possibly follow a man like this. Yet, I recognise it's not the first time in history, and in Australia, particularly amongst the blue-collar working community of which I am a part, I have heard a lot of support and praise for him. While I do not have any training in mental health and am unable to give a diagnosis, I do believe Trump is a complete and utter narcissist, and watching the events of the last few weeks unfold has led me to ask, do you think it is fair to say that Trump does not actually care much for making America great again, but rather making Trump great? Could the argument be made that he views America and the presidency as an extension of the Trump empire and his legacy? As a man of advanced years, is he looking to leave behind what he might consider to be the greatest legacy of all? Jason, what are your thoughts?
Wow, what a question. Gareth, you are an astute observer of neopopulism. Yes, I believe that one thing that all neopopulist leaders share in common is the connection of themselves, their personal ego, and that of the nation and their plans. Trump does want to make Trump great again when he says, make America great again. 100%. And There are reasons for this. I am going to direct you to the book of our previous podcast guest, Marcel Dercius, How Tyrants Fall. He explains that as a tyrant, it may make sense to be revenge-oriented, to have crazy loyalty tests, and to have a thin skin. All of those things help you weed out traitors or have a coterie of loyalists who won't turn on you, who are personally dependent to you. And Trump wants this. You have to parrot back. Yes, I believe the 2020 election was stolen, dear Donald. Of course, you are the greatest president in American history, my dear Donald. This is not just ego. If we look at someone like Putin, he wants to be allowed to, in his 70s, play ice hockey with his shirt off and score 7 goals against the top Russian teams of Olympic athletes who are 22 years old. Why is this? You may say this is some kind of childlike wish fulfillment fantasy. And I would say that there are deep-rooted psychological reasons why thin-skinned, narcissistic megalomaniacs who have the dark triad traits are going to try to lead neopopulist movements. I can also direct you to Brian Klass's book, Corruptible, which delves into this. So you've hit on something. He is an utter narcissist. I wonder, though, if we on the left, or the center left, more importantly, can use this to our advantage. I appeared on something called The Weekend Show by Midas Touch with Anthony Davis, and I was panned for occasionally saying that some things that Trump does are good. But a broken clock is right twice a day, and some of the things that he does, Jane, as much as we might cringe to admit it, they are good. And I think that he prevented more killing in Iran. The way that he dropped the bunker busters, got Netanyahu to end the war, hundreds or thousands of more people might have died. He brought that war to an end because he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He's not going to win it, but he has some bizarre megalomaniac desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize. We in the center left can encourage him, get Bibi to end the war in Gaza. Get the hostages back, do other things. Why? Because you're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Does he care about Palestinian children who are starving to death? By all accounts, he does not care one iota. But he is enough of a narcissist that if he can be made to believe that saving these children will somehow benefit his own internal ego goals, he might just do it. So I think that this is a very double-edged sword. What say you?
Well, it's the age-old use of flattery for political influence that you speak of, Jason, and I think that Donald Trump probably will not win the Nobel Peace Prize, but I think he will actually have many, many nominations because people know this is something that he wants. We've already seen Netanyahu say that he's nominated him, and Pakistan.
And that's not self-serving at all.
They can kind of understand each other, I think, these two leaders. The government of Pakistan has also said that they would nominate him because of his great work in de-escalating between India and Pakistan, although I think they have soured slightly because they weren't too happy with what happened with Iran. But I think that everyone now is trying to adapt to this transactional world and work out what kind of tributes they can bring to the leader. And this is also why our friends in the Gulf monarchies get on quite well with Trump, because they know very, very well how to deal with those kinds of leaders who are advancing in years, who identify the interests of the country with the interests of themselves, and like a bit of fancy grandeur.
Please join us after the break, my dear listeners, as we discuss lions and tigers and bears. Oh, I mean Zelensky, Putin, and Russia.
Oh my.
I'm Cindy Lauper with fellow Cosentix advocate, Chef Michelle Bernstein.
We'll share our experiences with plaque psoriasis, with psoriatic arthritis, and Dr. Panica will talk about the possible connection.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some are fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur.
Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com/Cindy.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustral implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
This is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone. Including a pioneering surgeon who rebuilt the shattered faces of soldiers in the First World War.
You know, he would look at these men and he would say, "Don't worry, Sonny, you'll have as good a face as any of us when I'm done with you."
Join me, Alex von Tunzelmann, for History's Heroes. Subscribe to History's Heroes wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm back after the break with the one, the only, the Jane Kinnenmont. Here we have a verbose and eloquent guest by the name of Gareth P. We've already read one of your questions, Gareth, but you seem to love the program enough. Here's another one. I am truly horrified after Trump's meeting with Zelensky. I'm convinced America has an ego running the country in place of a human. Oh, this is really echoing your previous question, Gareth. And that ego has surrounded itself with people happy to massage it. A tactical move, but quite dictatorial. Is there anyone who can or will call Trump out on his lies and distorted view of world events? What is the current pulse of America? Are the people happy to run with his brazen lies? Or are the cracks beginning to show amongst those who voted him in? Oh, Gareth, great question. And when you sent it, you wouldn't know how much those cracks really are showing. Because Jane, tell us about all this amazing stuff that's been brewing in Trump world.
Well, sure, I'll pick up exactly on that last point about whether cracks are beginning to show among those who voted him in. We can talk about the Make America Great Again base, the MAGA base. Already, it's been somewhat divided over Trump's decision to bomb Iran. And recently, things have really been fired up over Jeffrey Epstein, the dead, previously jailed, convicted sex trafficker who networked with many of the rich and famous around the world and who did know Donald Trump, as well as Prince Andrew and many others who have been somewhat embarrassed by the scandals around him. And, you know, I don't fully understand what it is about the Epstein case particularly that has MAGA really fixated on this. But you can tell us, because there's something about this. Will we let him? Will we let him? Go on, Jason. Why? Why this example of crass sexism when, you know, apparently the Tate brothers are fine? What is it about the Epstein issue that really has this seemingly going deep into MAGA identity and concerns?
Thank you, Jane. It isn't about sexism. It's that the MAGA movement has embraced conspiracy theories, of whom the most important is QAnon. QAnon asserts that there's a pedophiliac ring that runs the world through connections of financiers and politics.
And pizzas.
That's somehow connected to the Clintons and the Democratic Party. But it turns out there was a pedophiliac ring which got away with tons of abuses, and Epstein was able to get out of jail in Florida after he was initially convicted. But it's quite connected to Donald Trump himself. Ergo, if you've been saying, you know, we're really willing to have kids starve over there and to have tariffs that shoot ourselves in the foot and crash the global economy, but the one thing that we don't accept is abuse of young white girls. I think this is key. It's the abuse of young white girls from kind of lower middle class backgrounds, i.e. potentially Trump voting backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore we're cracking down on those horrible, morally bankrupt elites and establishment who are doing this, who are supposed to just be coastal Democrats. But it turns out that it was Trump. That Trump said, I know this guy Epstein. He likes beautiful women, sometimes on the younger side. But there's nothing wrong with that. We have him on tape saying this.
God.
Why did he say this? Because, what do you know, he was there. We have to keep in mind that in 2023, Don Jr. said, release the list. And of course, there was no complete client list. Epstein didn't have a client list. He had a range of relationships with people, some of whom he treated to special parties. But there were lists and notations, and Ghislaine Maxwell and others may know who was there. If Donald was there, this exposes in a MAGA lens the degree of his hypocrisy. You and I know that he's a hypocrite, right? Many people in MAGA would say he may be a bad businessman. He may even be corrupt, but he's not a hypocrite. He says, I don't care about screwing the economy. We're just going to have ICE raid these, Home Depots and kick people out. So it screws the economy, so what? But I said it, and I'm doing it. I said I wasn't going to make wars in the Middle East. I did the bunker buster, and I ended the war. Those things are policy things that they can disagree with, but they're not the exposing of Trump as a complete hypocrite, the way that if he's on the Epstein list. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is already defecting from Trump over this issue, and she is like the standard bearer. If Trump is on this Epstein list and he's caught lying about it, this very much undermines the way in which Trumpian conspiratorial stuff plays out. It would be like if RFK was found to have vaccinated all of his kids and believes in extra vaccines to protect. Do you know what I mean? It turns out that he's like a vaccine megadoser, and he's saying this for people's benefit. That degree of hypocrisy is quite different than the transactionalism and corruption and even sexism and rape and sexual harassment, which Trump supporters expect of Donald. This would showcase a degree of hypocrisy and downright sleazebagness that the MAGA cannot accept. It crumbles their worldview. So we're going to be hearing about Epstein, to my mind, all the way to the midterms and even through them.
Well, that explains a lot about why this seems to stick more than a bunch of other stuff like Russia, and that is my cue to segue neatly into Russia, because you get a lot of questions about Russia. We have an interesting one this week from Thomas G. He says that he has been thinking about the Western perceptions of how strong Russia is, and that he feels that most of the media can only see Russia as being super strong. He writes, with a gleeful Putin rubbing his hands together, plotting his next move. Well, this seems to me to miss the fact that it is his country that is at war, under sanctions, and losing hundreds of soldiers on a daily basis. What would happen if Ukraine were to be defeated and occupied by Russia? I'm not sure that would work out so well for Russia if it had to resource the occupation of a country that doesn't want to be occupied. We've seen in recent history how this can go in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, Russia's seen a bit of Afghanistan in its own past, I add. Going back to Thomas's question, Russia has not even managed the first bit of this scenario, the defeat of Ukraine. So what are the good outcomes for Russia in this whole thing? Finally, he's asking about the perception that really seems widespread in Europe that an emboldened Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But is that realistic? Wouldn't it be less likely that a war-weary Russia would be keen to attempt another war elsewhere? I don't think the West should be complacent about this, says Thomas, but this just isn't some kind of golden horde capable of sweeping through Europe. What are your thoughts, Jason?
Firstly, great question, Thomas, but mega orderers, please, brevity is the example of wit. Please write us at disordershow@gmail.com, but we are going to have a preference in the next question and answer show for questions that are less than 100 words. More than 100 words, very useful for Jane and I, who we get paid to talk and bloviate for a living. But you, the mega orderer, please be concise. So, I think there are 3 points here that you've raised, Thomas. 1, I agree. Russia is not as strong as the Western media or Western popular consciousness imagines. And this is proved by the fact that everyone was said, if Trump threatens arms deliveries to Ukraine, if Trump isn't seen as supportive of Ukraine, they're going to lose immediately. The Russians will just take Kyiv. Hasn't happened. The Ukrainians are quite strong. They're experts in drones. They're experts in certain kinds of intel. They did that genius attack on the Russian planes as far away as Siberia. So yeah, Russia is not that strong, and it's very corrupt. Second point, if the Russians would occupy the country after Ukraine was tragically defeated, and the Ukrainians were able to continue an insurgency attacking the Russian occupation, logistics, and administrative buildings, yeah, I think that the Russians could get bogged down. And a situation where Ukrainians and Russians are not so differentiable by race and language, because Ukrainians can impersonate Russians even if they don't want to speak Russian at home. They can mostly, and they can impersonate Russians. They could be very effective at blowing up and disturbing Russian stuff. So you're right. The Russians could not occupy indefinitely a Ukrainian populace committed to not being occupied. Putin's goal was the silly idea that people would just abandon Zelensky, and once Kyiv was, essentially captured without a fight, they would accept a new puppet government. Do you know what I mean? He wasn't planning on 10 years of dealing with insurgency and bombs and stuff. So yeah, 100% I agree with you there. And then the last point. Putin is not going to be sweeping through the rest of Europe. Yes, even if the war would somehow conclude, either by a peace treaty, hopefully, or by a Russian victory, what we don't hope for, or what we do hope for, by a Ukrainian victory, I would not see in any of these scenarios that the Russians are all of a sudden going to be like, oh, we can just invade Estonia. People talk about it, and it's relevant to prepare for it, but I disagree with Bill Browder and some others who say, oh, well, Estonia and Latvia are just next in the chopping block. They're about to be invaded. That's wrong. I think that we should take the Russian frozen assets anyway. So I agree with Bill in terms of what we should do. But we don't need to scaremonger in terms of Russian strength and proclivities. Jane.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on this point about the dangers elsewhere in Europe, because I think that these are often not very well described. It does seem unlikely that Putin has vast territorial designs on all of Europe when actually Ukraine itself is not going well from his point of view. But for Russia, NATO is an enemy, and it would be in Putin's interest to see NATO weakened. Now, invading Poland blatantly with ground forces would probably be precisely the sort of move that would make NATO coalesce and come together and see off that threat, because that's what NATO was designed for. But Russia is likely to be more interested in trying to find ways to probe NATO's defences with hybrid attacks, with cyber attacks, with the kind of sabotage operations that are already happening, with interfering in politics, with trying to support isolationist groups that have a positive view of Russia and so forth. So a lot of the stuff that's going on is probably going to be below the threshold. And I think that European governments in Western Europe are struggling to explain those kinds of scenarios to their populations. I think it's well understood in Eastern Europe, because of their proximity to Russia and their history, that they look at this stuff on a daily basis. But I think the UK hasn't really managed to make the case to the public here about why it believes that so much more money needs to be invested in defence for the years ahead. And just finally, I'll put this in the show notes as well, but there was an interesting survey last week by the British Foreign Policy Group that does an annual survey of attitudes to key foreign policy issues broken down by age, as well as things like party affiliation. And it found that 18 to 25-year-olds were the least likely to support Ukraine, that less than 1 in 5 of them said that Britain should be actively supporting Ukraine, whereas the people that are over 65 have much, much stronger support. So this is a challenge, especially if you're looking at military recruitment. What age group are you recruiting into an army? How do you make sure that there is clear support for defending NATO countries in the future? Obviously, Ukraine's not a NATO country, but NATO hasn't been seriously tested so far by a major war. How do you keep that kind of solidarity together?
Oh, no, Jane. Essentially, when the young are asked, do you want to pay taxes? They say no. Would you like to serve in the army? No. Would you like to defend your country? No. Selfishness really does seem to be contagious. That was a very scary answer. Listeners, please join. Please join the Substack, because we're going to have more information on this and the survey that Jane mentioned there. Okay, we love dedicated fans like Ludwig, who has written to follow up on his earlier question. He writes, after listening to Jason and Alex discussing my question on the June question and answer show, I feel like I should have explained my question a lot better. The point of view behind my question was that I believe finance has some advantages compared to politics and international relations, because financial markets and all the participants create millions, if not billions, of data points each day. It's a lot easier to quantify the objective truth of reality. Also, the data has been really easy to mine, for instance, since the late 60s and the advent of computers, when empirical finance basically had its big bang. This creates a stark contrast to politics, where A, the goals were quite subjective, versus finance, i.e. you just want to make money, and B, it's difficult to actually measure what's going on. However, it's very likely that all the biases and systematic decision-making errors observed in finance, i.e. behavioral economics, also apply to politics. Now I need to interject on Ludwig here. Preach on, preacher. That's what I'm all about. That's what I write about in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. We need a behavioral turn in international relations theory. What the economists did from classical economics to behavioral economics, we need to do in the study of diplomacy, as we have behavioral diplomacy. Great. Now back to Ludwig. I'd like to just touch on a few things just to illustrate my point. One, cognitive dissonance. Our human brain doesn't like holding two conflicting thoughts at the same time. This makes nuanced, more balanced perspective unpopular by default, as they incorporate arguments from both sides. We are much more at ease advocating for a simple, radical truth. Now I'm going to interject again. That is so right. That's why when I say that one thing that Trump does is correct, people hate on me and they say that it can't be the case. 2, recency bias. We humans emphasize our recent experiences and make decisions based on these. This is true for investors who believe in a real estate boom that house prices can only go up, but also for think tankers who believe that the near future is likely to be a repetition of the near past. And 3, confirmation bias. We are constantly looking for information which makes our preformed beliefs more credible, and we neglect all other possible scenarios. Are you accusing me of saying that the world is in disorder because I happen to make a podcast called Disorder? And then finding confirmation bias and seeing disorder all around me, rather than just seeing the markets going up and considering it order? Back to you, Ludwig. I therefore believe the best strategy to a better life for all, both in politics and finance, could be found in the application of psychology's findings. Have you seen instances where policies or political decision-making have started doing it? Wow, there's a lot to tackle, Jane. Swing for the fences.
Super, super interesting. I mean, on one level, like anyone who's trying to influence anyone else is using psychology. So people are using this all the time in political campaigning, in diplomacy. I think that in any state, diplomats are the people who are really trained to try to step outside their own bubble and to see things from the point of view of others that can have radically different viewpoints and frames of reference and cultural understandings, because you need to know how they will perceive your words. But in terms of the kind of cognitive bias issues, I think there's so much to dig into here. I have seen some of these issues raised as people try to understand the risks of artificial intelligence in military systems. So along with the biases that you mentioned, for example, there is a belief that humans have automation bias, that, you know, if you have an AI system that tells you these are the people that we've identified are terrorists that you should shoot, you find it easier to say yes than to say no, right? Because there's a sense that, like, the computer is right. So that's going to be a really critical area of research. How do humans interact with machines? How do we process and evaluate AI results? Because we know that they are not always right. So how do we prevent ourselves from getting lazy and relying on these things in complex conflict situations? I think another one that it's more speculative for me, but I've been thinking about it recently. I came across this concept called reticular activation, right? Reticular activation, which basically means when you look for something, you see more of it. So basically, this is the psychology behind the idea of gratitude journaling that you might hear about if you're into wellness stuff. That if you sit down at the end of the day and you write down 3 things that you are grateful for, the next day you start to notice more stuff that you're grateful for because you've primed your brain to look for those things. Now, that is really benign. You know, let's all think of something lovely that happened today. But I am sure that this also comes into play when people see bias against them. Because I have often wondered how it is that, you know, when you go to a conflict area, people, you know, if you're British, they'll immediately start to talk to you about the BBC, and absolutely everybody thinks the BBC is biased against them. I'm not saying BBC is perfect. You can study media bias, but to study media bias, you have to actually look at data and find a way to analyse it. Instead, people very often build up impressions like, I never see myself represented. I always see them overrepresented. And I think it is a trick of the mind. And that we should all be really conscious of that. Am I just seeing this because that's what I'm used to seeing? Am I ignoring the other stuff? How can we assess these cognitive biases so that we're less likely to fall victim to misunderstandings or even misinformation?
Ludwig, you have truly earned the title of super orderer, which is apparently beyond that of mega orderer, because you're getting at the essence of what interests me in our age of global enduring disorder. It is an age in which, despite all of the information being accessible and having the access to all these computer tools to come up with better decisions, humans, due to a range of cognitive biases, are making worse decisions on longer-term policy than they ever had. They're flip-flopping back and forth between let's raise the taxes, let's lower the taxes. Let's have these taxes on high net worth individuals in this way. Then let's not. Let's have them based on residency in that way. And then they come up with a worse outcome than if nothing had been done. And that's what you're getting at here. Due to our era of global enduring disorder, where people's attention spans are so short, where there's so much populism and they want results immediately and things are so ideological and there's no consensus politics, we more make the wrong mistake for the 3 reasons you mentioned and many others. Cognitive dissonance, recency bias, confirmation bias. And I think that's the tragedy of our era. Now, Jane, this question is from Edward John Salisbury Trelawney. Sorry for mangling your name. I would like you to now pronounce the name correctly Britishly.
I believe we're hearing from Edward John Salisbury Trelawney. And would you like me to read Mr. Salisbury Trelawney's question to you, Jason?
I would, yes.
So this is really interesting, following on from Thomas's question, where he thought it was unlikely that Russia would launch more invasions. Edward says, we seem to be creeping towards a Russian invasion of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, and with the unspoken threat that the USA may continue to provide a nuclear umbrella, but not troops or any unfunded weaponry on the ground. So, in this scenario, all other NATO nations are potentially fighting, losing sons and daughters, and placing themselves in massive war-related debt, borrowing heavily in order to buy from the key large rich ally, the USA. Would this then make the US incredibly wealthy and, in their terms, great? In this scenario, he envisages Greenland could be handed over as payment for war-related debt. Canadian war-related debt could cripple Canada unless they choose to become a US state. And he finally asks, very USA of 1939 to 1942, I know, but is Trump capable of risking us all for wealth, fame, and the benefits of expanding his territory to dominate the newly opening Arctic trade routes? What do you think of this vision of the future, Jason?
It's very frightening. It's very thoughtful. I don't see it happening, fortunately. Again, just like the whole Trump isn't a fascist thing, I don't think he's going to invade Greenland, and I don't think that there's any deep strategy here. There's no strategy to, get the Europeans to have to pay for American weapons and then have them be in debt and take their territories. It's very evil what Trump is doing, but I just don't see it as systematic, right? You'd need to be so systematic to think, I'll let there be a war and then people will have to buy American arms purchases and American AI, and then they'll be indebted to us and we can expand American territory. On the question of Canada, Canada is not becoming a U.S. state. I'm sorry. Full fucking stop. From the No 51 license plates and bumper stickers to the election of Mark Carney to where they're at as a country, we've got to give it to the Canadians. They are true mega orderers. They elected Carney. They are standing firm, elbows up. So it would be, I think, very, very naive to project that forward. It would be as absurd as to say that America will become Canada's 12th or 13th province. It's just not happening, right? The countries do have an asymmetry of power, but Canada is a strong country. It's the second largest country in the world in terms of land area. It has a very wealthy per capita GNP, and it has a stronger national identity than most people will give it credit. And when you have a strong national identity, you may lose a war, but you're not disappearing as a country. We can discuss these scenarios, but I think I'm emerging from the world thinking that Canada is a much more important global player than 3 or 4 years ago. They're not giving up their sovereignty anytime soon for war debt or for any other reasons. On Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Putin is crapping out. He can't even take Ukraine. How could he invade the Baltics? He can't invade the Baltics. Greenland? The Danes did a genius job getting all of the EU on their side, and they're not going to sell Greenland. It's just not happening. Might there be a Greenland independence referendum? Potentially, right? Because there are some ethnic and colonial tensions there. But U.S. takeover of Greenland? Maybe only if the Greenlanders voted for it in a referendum. I just can't see a hostile occupation of Greenland. So, am I being naive, Jane?
Well, I think right now it's good for us to hear these kinds of scenarios that seem incredibly unlikely, simply because so much incredibly unlikely stuff is happening right now. So I would say keep them coming, listeners. Let's hear more out-of-the-box thinking about weird ways that the world might end up in the next few years. Things that sound like wild cards might be tomorrow's news. So hopefully not the one that you've laid out, though. But thanks. Now, in our last few minutes of the show, let's turn to the Middle East for a bit, because I think there's a couple of things that we should update listeners on. You've mentioned, Jason, Trump's ending the brief war between Israel and Iran, and that ceasefire so far has held. But the Iran nuclear issue is not going away. I think many observers are worried that maybe this war is on pause rather than resolved. So I'm curious to know your thoughts as an American in Britain about whether the Europeans, and by that I mean the E3, the UK, France and Germany, who were driving forces in the JCPOA, can they do anything useful? Right now, they are threatening to use the last vestiges of the JCPOA to try to push Iran back to the negotiating table, because until the end of October, which will be 10 years since the JCPOA was signed, there is this untested mechanism in the JCPOA that is supposed to give leverage to make sure that Iran complies with the agreement. This mechanism is called snapback sanctions, and it was actually thought of at the time, 10 years ago, by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister then, now, and pretty much always. He basically proposed that if the JCPOA failed and Iran was breaking it, then UN sanctions could be reimposed on Iran. And the Western countries said, well, you won't allow that to happen because Iran's your ally, nor will China. So Lavrov proposed a formulation which was a unique mechanism to get something to happen through the UN Security Council that could not be vetoed. The idea is that if any signatory to the JCPOA invokes snapback and says Iran is not complying with the agreement, then UN sanctions snap back on automatically without anyone being able to say no. However, this was obviously designed 10 years ago for the scenario that people had in their heads at the time. And that goes back to why it's important to imagine the unlikely when you're doing something like making an agreement. Because at that time, people were thinking, what if Iran just reneged on the deal? What has happened, of course, is that the US abrogated the deal unilaterally. After that, Iran began to not comply with its provisions on enrichment. Loads of other things have happened since then. Iran's nuclear sites have been bombed, and Iran is saying this JCPOA mechanism doesn't apply anymore because basically none of the rest of the JCPOA is being upheld. But it's the only thing that the Europeans have as leverage, so that seems to be why they are using it. Is it a good idea for them to get involved? Should they actually leave this one to the US and Iran and maybe countries in the Middle East, which would be Israel, but obviously, of course, the Gulf Arab countries? What's the role for our friends in Europe?
Great question, Jane. And I see you're already preemptively ordering the disorder because you're proposing a role for the Europeans where they can mediate between the US and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other, and that they can do so in a legal means. Whether or not a provision was designed with a certain outcome in mind or not, it's on the books, and it can be used either as a lever or a threat. I totally believe that only the Europeans can get the Iranians back in a legal deal over enrichment and take to the next level the new Middle East that Trump and Netanyahu claim to want but will never get there about. Trump and Netanyahu are disorderers. The Europeans can be orderers. However, we don't see it happening yet, and that's sad. I'd like to see Merz, Macron, and Starmer 100% on the same page saying, great, we are going to do these investments and we're going to have this force which works with the IAEA to do these inspections and which does this and does that. I see an opportunity to get Iran and Israel kind of to a position where they're not enemies anymore and the Iranians are not working with proxy militias, and that the war has led to like a more peaceful Middle East, a Middle East where Hezbollah and the Houthis can exist as political movements, but ones that are not armed by the outside, and that Iran can unleash its human capital and be a wealthy and well-integrated country in the Gulf region. So there's a huge amount of opportunity. And the leverage of the snapback sanctions could be used, but Trump and Witkoff, they don't have the attention spans as well as the neutrality that are needed to make that happen.
I think snapback is unlikely to work. I think it's really problematic, but I do agree there needs to be a much more ambitious look at all of this, because ultimately the nuclear issue is only an issue really because of the politics and the deep, deep insecurity that there is in the region. The JCPOA, we've both said lots of positive points about JCPOA in earlier discussions, but at the end of the day, the world took its eye off the ball and didn't go the extra mile they needed to go to try to fix the underlying regional security and geopolitical problems. Because they're very difficult, yes, I know. But without fixing them, we are just going to have these problems that recur and recur. So something that is broader and comprehensive and more ambitious does seem worthwhile. And, you know, that's something that can be marketed to the Trump administration, which wants to do big stuff, but someone else needs to do the legwork. So, Jason, we've had a lot of questions from listeners about the situation in Gaza, where the misery goes on, with reports every single day of people being shot trying to get food, no sign of a ceasefire despite the hype, plus the so-called humanitarian city plan. Do you think there's scope for anything to change from inside Israel? And what can the rest of the world do to change the situation?
Wow, Jane. Yeah, I think part of the reason we don't talk about Gaza is I feel that it is talked to death in the mainstream media and in the commentariat on the left and on the right. And therefore, we want to be more orderly, providing new perspectives on new issues. Yes, there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There's no debate about that. What are Netanyahu's war aims? Is he trying to root Hamas out? It does seem that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the Israeli-backed American group, has had some problems rolling out its aid distribution system. But getting that aid distribution system in place so that Gazans are not starving, but Hamas cannot extort people to get their aid or use the aid and then sell it to stay in power in the Gaza Strip is critical. The details of how GHF is working and people getting shot at these distribution centers, again, that's covered infinitely to death elsewhere, so we're not going to get into that. I am going to talk about Netanyahu losing his coalition. We don't know if there are going to be new elections because the election legislation was not able to be drawn up, I believe, before the Knesset went for its summer recess. It won't be back for the winter session until October. But Netanyahu is on thin ice because he's also losing the United Torah Judaism Party and some other ultra-Orthodox who don't want to get drafted. And therefore he's having fissures on the right between the knitted kippahs, the Dati Leumis, who get drafted and participate in mainstream Zionism, and the Black Hatters, the black kippahs, who don't want to get drafted because they just want to do yeshiva study. And it could be that that could bring down the government. So what can the rest of the world do? We can try to work with different parts of the Israeli society and Knesset to get Netanyahu out of power. I don't mind Trump offering him refuge in Florida so that he can avoid his corruption cases if he steps down, and work with the Israeli electorate to promise them billions of high-tech investment and rebuilding after the war if they, for example, agree to a Palestinian state. And Trump and Witkoff and the Europeans and Starmer and his people can try to help the Saudis make a deal with Israel. And as part of that deal, make sure that Gazans have their rights back and their homes and scholarships to study in the Gulf and maybe places to get training and jobs and all of that. So there's going to need to be a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. I do think it's useful to get Netanyahu out and that Europeans and Americans can work together to try to order the disorder to get Netanyahu out.
Well, that's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, you can tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every episode launches.
We're on YouTube. Please follow the link in the show notes.
And finally, you can read more about today's topic by subscribing to our Substack, and there'll be a bunch of cool links in there for you to see.
Our producer is the one, the only, the George McDonough. This podcast is made in co-production with Evergreen Podcasts.
Thanks for listening, and hope you have an orderly week.
Are you tired of starting your day with pointless political arguments, superficial summaries, and lukewarm hot takes on the radio?
Then switch to The Bunker, where we look at the news without the nonsense.
Every weekday morning, The Bunker brings you a brand new, in-depth look at just one story.
From the chaos in Washington to the seismic political shifts in the UK.
To business, economics, history, and pop culture.
Or start your week, our essential Monday morning roundup of the week's upcoming stories.
We cut through the noise to bring you what matters.
That's The Bunker, news without the nonsense. Every weekday with me, Andrew Harrison,
Ross Taylor,
Jacob Jarvis,
Gavin Essler,
Sing Sing,
and me, Seth Jebble.
Find us wherever you get your podcasts.